Hello, good morning. Happy that you could come. It's a sunny day outside. All the more, sort of like as Gianluca said, it's very important to get our minds ready and to, try to break the boundaries or the barriers we have in our heads. And when you were you were mentioning what the German crowds in Leipzig and other places in 1989 shouted, "Wir sind ein Volk," I couldn't help thinking about your former Prime Minister, Giulio Andreotti, who said that I love the Germans so much I would love to have two of them, which actually brings me in medias res, so to speak, and gives me the opportunity to explain a little bit the title of the lecture, Making Europe from the Margins, the Politics of Conscience and the Fall of the Berlin Wall, because it actually brings in the idea of the two Germanys and the two Europes that we had certainly until 1989, probably have more than two Europes nowadays. Pretty many new boundaries perhaps, but let's go back to this period before 1989. I would just briefly expound what I would like to do, and I would probably speak less directly about the wall. I will really speak about the forces that helped removing the wall. I don't think, well, it was certainly the work of many Germans and East Germans, but I think there was much more groundwork having been done before that, a little bit further east, and that pushed, in a way, the East Germans to take the courage into their hands as well. So basically, let me start by some preliminary remarks about the terms of the question, or the terms in the lecture. And this title appears actually quite counterintuitive, because the conventional wisdom is that Europe has been built on values, norms, as well as concrete frameworks of power, such as the nation-state, capitalist economies, or the liberal traditions of the rule of law. So there is a major stream in the work on Europe, European studies, which looks at the economistic aspect, at the strategies and the economic rationality for bringing Europe together. So there is certainly something like an idea of the center of Europe, or the heart of Europe. And we have seen that in the debates about, to what extent does Turkey belong to Europe, or the Ukraine could belong to Europe. There are certain things at the margins which don't appear so clear. Do they have a Christian heritage? Do they have traditions of the rule of law? Are they sufficiently democratic? So what do I mean by making the Europe from the margins? Can there actually be a case to be made that you can make Europe from the margins if you don't have a clearly defined center? And the second part of the lecture is even more doubtful, so to speak, because can conscience be a reliable and effective instrument in politics? If politics is struggle, what is the arm of conscience? What is the weapon of conscience? What is its armament? How can conscience help removing material structures built by a coercive regime, like the wall? The conventional wisdom in political thought and political theory certainly is that conscience cannot coerce, let alone achieve control, security, and peace in political communities. Rather, if you rely too much on conscience, you actually produce conflict, struggle, and internal strife. The unarmed prophet in politics, as Max Weber, famous political sociologist and philosopher of German origin, said already, is bound to succumb to violence. So, evidently, I will make the case that this all makes, nevertheless, quite a lot of sense, and I try to come, to take you with me on that journey. Hopefully, it's going to be a nice one. We go slowly, we go together, right? Chi va piano va sano e va lontano. I was surprised that you looked for the African proverb. You have, it's wonderful. Italian proverb. So, which means, by the way, if you go slowly and if you go healthily, you go very, very far. Okay, so what do I mean by making of Europe? I mentioned already that the standard approach, I would claim, is that there is something like a historical core of Europe. And if we go back to the history of the European community, we can probably talk about what some people call the Vatican Europe, namely Benelux, France, Germany, and Italy. Others would argue that what really makes Europe are certain core values and the frameworks of economic and political power, and also the moral capacity of, based on these values that derive from them, like capitalism, science, technology, individualism, or the rule of law. By these standards, everything that was founding itself on the east of the former Iron Curtain was sort of by definition excluded. It was excluded from the civilizational identity, so to speak, of Europe. Symbolically, the Iron Curtain cemented the Yalta Order, the order that was, brought together in the Conference of Yalta, which actually decided that, where the Soviet army will go, this will be its sphere of interest, and where the other Western allies will go, this will be their sphere of influence. Culturally, there has been a long-standing split between the Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. You could certainly add here Protestantism, and it wasn't so clear-cut either because, our Croatian friends, I don't know where they're sitting, but, if you consider that Yugoslavia was to a certain extent part of this Iron Curtain, although this Iron Curtain at that border was perhaps could be penetrated a little bit easier. Certainly Croatia was always a Catholic country, not an Orthodox one. But if we simply look at the fact that, which of the countries that joined in 2004, the European Union, had actually existed before 1918, you won't find actually very many. There's only one, namely Hungary. And Hungary has been really decimated, very shrunk down after 1919. So there was not even Eastern Europe, properly speaking, before the end of World War I, Eastern Europe in its current appearance. So basically, the point I'm trying to make is here that the eastern part of Europe has little of a stake in being actually accepted as being a fully fledged part of Europe. Croatian writer Slavenka Drakulic once said that Eastern European countries wished to push the dividing line between East and West as far to the east as possible, so that eventually Europe will be a whole undivided continent. So she was actually expressing very clearly that what Europe was until 1989 certainly was a kind of entity that conceived itself as the whole of Europe, but it actually was only Western Europe. And the eastern part was there to define its status as the only Europe. This was the part that was actually at the time lying outside Europe. So basically, the case to make about the question how we can make Europe from the margins is to ask how could the margins of Europe be more than passive elements that have been eventually after that liberated, added upon, or enlarged. I think the term enlargement was probably, for many people now living in what is Central Europe now, or former Eastern Europe, certainly east of the former Iron Curtain, was actually kind of like a bit of an insult. What does it mean to be enlarged? I mean, we've always been part of Europe. So, I would basically now try to make the counter case. Namely the case that what is considered to be Europe from a center has never been so surely a center. So I would basically go about to question the centrality of the center, first of all, and argue that Europe could only come together because this, what is considered to be the center, experienced quite heavy and important fractures and a very massive existential insecurity. When we talk about the European center, and when we would probably, few people would disagree that if we look at Germany and France, we're pretty much there in the center. We can certainly discuss that, but these two countries have been considered the center of the European project. Now, before the First World War, this center of Europe was defined by other considerations, not that we have to create a united Europe. The consideration was imperial power, nation state, competition between the great powers. And when George Kennan and others called the First World War the originary catastrophe of Europe, that meant that this was the end of the great imperial and nation-state project of the European countries. And it was the realization that we have actually destroyed something here. So we have actually fractured something. We had fractured our own power center, and after the First World War, Europe wasn't what it used to be before. The centers of power were actually removed from Europe. They were starting, grow in Russia and in the United States. So the case I want to make is that when we talk about European identity, when we talk about how can we establish an idea of the center of Europe, we have to look at the losses. We have to look at the fractures, first of all. And I would like to head that with a quote from Ursula Hirschmann, who was one of the founders of the European Federalist movement, who was once in a meeting. She was actually German but lived in Italy, and then she realized in this meeting that she could not express herself properly in any language. So she had lost her German, which was mother tongue, and that had become flat and inflexible. And Italian, the language in which her children had been raised, was actually a foreign language. So she felt European, she said, because she felt uprooted and wandering and not really fully in the capacity of express herself 100%. So she was sort of like being in between, a wanderer between the worlds. So that's like, her background cultures. And then she said, well, she writes about that, we déracinés is a French word for uprooted, of Europe, who have crossed the borders more often than we have changed our shoes, have nothing to lose than our chains in a federalist Europe. And so it is that we are federalists. Now, feeling at the edge and being in recognition of something in a way that we want and desire very much has been a fundamental aim and desire in Eastern Europe. And when I use Eastern Europe, I really would like to stress that I mean everything that was sitting on the east of the Iron Curtain before 1989, because I know that the term Eastern Europe is quite heavily contested, especially in Central Europe. So when Czechs or Croatians or Poles are called Eastern Europeans, that may sound not always will go down very easily, but I mean it really in this sense here. It's probably well known, Pavel has now left, but Milan Kundera, who is another very famous Czech person, a writer, coined this idea once that Central Europe was kidnapped by the barbarian civilization of Russia. So he defined, in a way, Central Europe against Russia. I will say something about that later, because I'm not completely in agreement. I think certainly if we call Russia barbarian, I think there's a problem with that as well. But let's now move to, I would like to give a little bit of an outline of Eastern Europe and what I mean by marginality in that part, before I go to the question of what is politics of conscience, what actually, who are the actors, what does that mean, how can we make a case that there is a politics of conscience what does it mean? How can conscience again be political? If we define politics as a struggle for power, how can conscience enter into that struggle of power? Right. I would perhaps like to start with one of the claims is that many of the smaller nations in Eastern Europe did not even exist properly in the proper common Western sense of what we would say a nation exists or a state is strong to defend itself. And one of the main reasons is for that most of the statehood that we have in the eastern part of Europe, and I would to a certain extent even include Germany here, because Germany is actually a late developer. So Germany, in terms of the way the state has come together, resembles more the state formation of the Eastern European mold than it resembles the state formation of the Western European mold. But let's stay, first of all, with those countries that were part of former bigger empires, and all of these empires collapsed in 1918. Don't worry, Gianluca, I will talk about 1989 later. I'm just still at 1918, because I think everything else doesn't make sense if you don't understand that. So the four empires, Germany, Austria, Habsburg, Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire collapsed. And the key thing here is that many of these nations that then came up did not have territorial frames of their states that matched their national consciousness. So their national consciousness was not congruent with the states that were developed. A very good example is the Czech example. The Czechoslovakia was established, and they had minorities of the Hungarian and the German kind who didn't really fit what the Czechoslovaks actually wanted their state to be, their citizenship to be. And as often, writers express things much better than philosophers or political scientists. So I take a quote from Robert Musil's famous Austrian writer, Man Without Qualities. If anybody wants to read something fantastically in the German language or translation, should read that. So Robert Musil says something about his Austrian compatriots in 1913. And I quote, "If you asked an Austrian what he was, he would say a Pole, a Czech, an Italian, a Slovene, a Croat, a Serb, a Slovak." This was the so-called nationalism. And then he likened the Kacanians. The Kacanians were the members of the K and K monarchy, so the Kaiser and the Königlich, so the royal and imperial Habsburg, Austrian, Hungarian one. And then he said that they were like a squirrel who had no idea of itself, who was afraid of its own tail. So this is basically a quote to let you see that when we talk about Europe and the center, this idea that a state is an actor of capacity who has science, who has technology, who develops a strong economic system, who has an idea of what its borders are. There was a very, very, very low degree of a clear idea of what actually the borders, what our nations, what our consciousness was. So the argument would be that this part of Europe had a rather tenuous or weak idea of its own identity. It had a very unclear idea of what its borders were, what actually its nationality was, how far its national identity could actually develop. There were, of course, some countries like the Poles who had always a very strong sense of national identity, but they didn't have a state. So they had to, first of all, construct that state. And when they had constructed the state, after 20 years, they were invaded again and the state was destroyed again. And when they got a state again, they were again imposed a foreign regime to rule them. So it's very difficult in this part of the world, of Europe, to actually have a clear idea, a narrative about who we are, where do we come from, what do we want. And you may argue that's very different in the West. Because in the West, you have, one of my favorite examples is when is anybody here from France? No. We still manage, EUCA is a place where it's very European, but whenever I go to any of the events, there is never a French person. Which is very interesting in its own right. Okay, no, but when the French, they learn at school that their country is a hexagon, right? So they have a sort of like mental map of a shape, of a form, of a shape with 6 angles. And that means, of course, that this is a very long tradition. So in a way, the French state hasn't had many important changes to its borders in the last 500-600 years. There were some, but overall it's been a pretty long-standing thing. Now, very similar in Britain. Britain is an island and has a very long-standing tradition, so many people just don't even ask themselves. Our state is something that we can figure in our mind. The further east you go, and I don't want to go in any of the particular cases that we have here, but let's take only Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is a very good example that shows that it's not very clear what the borders are. The state can't actually protect its own borders, and some neighbors don't like the borders that have been established in 1991. So there's a very high degree of insecurity about borders, and borders are absolutely fundamental to understand who we are, what we want, how we relate to others, right? Now, how does that look when you look at the center of Europe? How does it look in Germany and France? You may argue that, of course, Germany and France know exactly what their borders are, but that's not so clear. Because in Germany has been united for 144 years now, right? But in these 144 years, Germany has lost a substantial amount of its territory. It has recovered some amount of the territory again. But in the meantime, it had 4 different regimes. If you count the GDR, actually 5 different regimes. So for the German case, it's not as clear as for the French case. But even in the French case, it's not so clear either, because you have had several republics, and most importantly, during World War II, and I'm already now at World War II, so I'm moving forward. In World War II, France was divided into 4 different sovereignties. So France was actually deeply affected during World War II about its own identity. There was Vichy France, there was the German occupied zone, there was the Free France in London, and there was the Resistance. So the French state in itself was in a kind of, I wouldn't call it civil war, but certainly in many there were different projects of France, and it was unclear where this would go. Germany disappeared as a state in 1945, and it came onto the map again as 2 states. So it was a divided nation. So a divided nation was very deeply unclear about what it was. You could then say, of course, there was a West German government, an East German government, and the West German government was clearly for Western integration, but it wasn't that clear. It was one vote that made Konrad Adenauer the Chancellor of West Germany. Had the Social Democrats had come to power, could have gone the other way around, and it would have been natural, in a way, to propose, first of all, that Germany should seek national unity rather than West integration. So basically, I would like you to, first of all, understand, or just in your head, make the case. If Eastern Europe was a marginal region with high territorial instability, no clear identity, weak state, so to speak, or certainly weak in terms of what it could produce as a capitalist economy, what it could produce in terms of democratic tradition, I'm not so convinced that the Western center was less marginal. We have to think, first of all, that it required a lot of conviction power and a lot of running against the established ideas and political projects to opt for a European project whose outcome was far from being, decided or clear in its head. As I would like to give you a quote from Jean Monnet, who put it as follows: "I've never been in doubt that this process of European integration would one day lead us to the United States of Europe, but I do not even try to imagine what the political framework will be." So there was, to a certain extent, a very strong impulse to do something that we thought would be the right thing to do, but there were very hazy ideas about what it in the end would become. So if I take perhaps a quote of another very famous Frenchman, Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, "On s'engage et puis on voit." So you get in and then you see what the situation is and you try to sort it out. But you first do it and then you think. Okay, so that was my sort of like the first part, as it were, trying to establish, first of all, what do we mean by the margins, right? Eastern Europe marginal, but Western Europe fundamentally also quite marginal, certainly uprooted, trying to come in a way together to find a higher project, a higher level of transcendence in order to sort out the national fractures, so to speak. But now comes the more difficult case, namely, what's the role of conscience in all that? And to put it the other way around, how could, and I will focus now on the Eastern European part, how could this marginal sphere of Europe actually develop some positive input? How could the East, so to speak, overcome its own fractures, its own fractured appearance, both in terms of a weak tradition of the nation state, but fundamentally overcome a political regime that was absolutely hostile to an integration with a sphere of Europe which was considered to be not only capitalist but fascist, which was considered to be sort of like ruled by the Americans, which was considered to be sort of like a region in which, the dignity of human beings is certainly the core of what the ideological regime of communism would consider to be, the people of, let's say the proletariat, those people, those miserable people who the capitalist regime was humiliating and making to suffer. So the question is, what is the case for politics of conscience? And the liberal English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes is quite well known, and anybody who studies political science or theory will know this name. He abhorred conscience politics. He would have argued that the wars that tore apart 17th century Europe were actually all based on conscience and faith and religion. German philosopher and political sociologist Max Weber argued that conviction politicians had no responsibility for the consequences of their action. He argued that you cannot make politics with an ethics of the Sermon of the Mount in the Matthew Gospel. If you strike me on one cheek, I should hold the other cheek to you. So, is there a case to be made for a politics of conscience that is responsible? Is there a case to be made for the seeking of truth as a political weapon, so to speak? Is there a case to be made for the unarmed prophet? To get back to Weber again, he argued his context was the end of the First World War and the question, how could Germany actually become a respectable state again? And he was surrounded by conviction politicians, so to speak. Revolution was ripe. You know, the Bolshevik Revolution was 2 years old, and there was quite a lot of pressure from the nationalist part on the right. And they had very, very strong convictions. The difference was, of course, that they tried to link the convictions to another form of power, namely the power of violence. So Trotsky had argued very clearly, you know, if you are an unarmed prophet, you can't go very far. You have to take up the arms. You have to take up the core of the state in order to push through your convictions. So Trotsky didn't want to go very, very slowly. He wanted to go very, very, very quickly. So Weber would have said that what you need, if you have conviction, if you have an ethics of conviction, so if you have some conscience, so to speak, you have to have nevertheless an inner weight to it. It's the inner weight. Are you just very convinced? Because, you know, there's this proverb, if you by the age of 20 you're not a communist, you have no heart. If you're by the age of 30 you still are a communist, you have no brain. So you're all probably closer to the 20s, right? And probably all your convictions are more supported by the heart, and that's good. But from a Weberian position, he would argue, in order to make something in politics, you have to have a certain sense of responsibility, and you have to have an inner weight. So your conviction, your heart should nevertheless have an inner weight, and the inner weight you probably get only with experience, or you will get it by considering more perspectives, by trying to find a way to achieve a certain consensus. However, in history, we know very well that it's not always power who wins. Power is also challenged. I mean, they go back to Antigone in ancient Greece, who disrespected the command of the king who refused the burial to her brother in the name of the human dignity. You know, it's a human dignity thing to receive a proper burial. You go well, some of the associates are from the Thomas More Institute, right? So Thomas More, somebody who claimed against the power of the king that you know, his conscience is what he has to follow. So you have ways and you have historical examples in which people do follow against they know very well by following these their own precepts from their conscience what the outcome will be. Weber himself mentions Martin Luther, who knew probably not exactly what his change of religion or what his intention to reform the church would bring about, but he basically then claimed that, well, here I stand, I can do no other. How does that all refer to the dissidence of intellectuals in democratic movements before 1989? We know that after 1989, Václav Havel and other dissidents, they became politicians. And they were often quite disenchanted with that. They were not born to be politicians, to sit over, you know, bureaucratic apparatuses and negotiate and deal with the sort of like hard, Weber calls it the drilling of hard boards. Politics is a very tedious business. You have to sit long hours, read through a lot of paper, drill hard boards, and very, very thick boards. But the dissidents in Eastern Europe, and I will particularly look at Poland and the Czech Republic here, and Czechoslovakia, they had experiences behind. Unlike Trotsky, they knew that you don't go very far with violence. First, because their own regimes were born out of violence. They were born out of a revolutionary regime, the Soviet revolutionary regime. And second, they had both experienced attempts at liberating their country with a revolution, often like a non-violent revolution, 1956 in Hungary, in Budapest, 1968 in Prague, in Bratislava. And both failed, both ended up under the invasion of the Soviet tanks. The Poles tried it differently in the Solidarity movement in 1980, in 1981, which was very largely non-violent, a protest movement, a national movement, started from a trade union movement. But even that was threatened by Soviet invasion and was resolved by declaration of martial law in 1981 in Poland. So they had actually, if we go back to the inner weight, there was something that made them see that violence is not an option. Violence is a no-go area, so to speak. Not only because it's unlikely that the regime will succumb to our very, very few means of violence, but also because if you really want to get rid of that regime, you have to show that you're morally superior. So you have to show against the regime that you completely disrespect and abhor, that you don't want to beat it with the means that underlie its own power. So here, in a way, Mahatma Gandhi is a very, very strong inspiration, the Indian activist, political activist and philosopher who coined the term of the soul force, the force of your soul, trying to convince others to follow your own model, your own example. I would like to perhaps substantiate it with a quote from Czesław Miłosz, who is a Polish writer, a Lithuanian Polish writer, who argued for why the communist regime as a totalitarian regime was so susceptible to challenges, especially on moral grounds. He said that in whatever totalitarian fanatical regime, the enemy in a potential form will always be there. The only friend will be the man who accepts the doctrine 100%. If he accepts only 99%, he will necessarily have to be considered a foe. From that remaining 1%, a new church can arise. So in a way, what dissidents had to produce was trying to convince the people that they can sort of like tap into the 1%. And from there, to undermine the system in a way that you would start seeing people falling away from following the prescriptions of that system. Václav Havel argued in The Power of the Powerless very clearly that what maintains the system is that basically people follow the nonsensical habits and prescriptions of that system. If they were starting not to follow it, the system would lose ground. It is upheld by the fact that the people are habitually basically brought into following this otherwise nonsensical system. Now, evidently, you can argue that if you make a case for I know the truth, right? My conscience is clear, I know the truth, and I want to go to it, and I want to convince you. You have plenty of examples in history which speak against that. You go from the Puritans of Oliver Cromwell to Robespierre, who knew what virtue was and thought that if everybody could be as virtuous as I, the world and France would be a perfect place. And those who cannot be as virtuous because they are born differently, like aristocrats, will have to chop off their heads. So the problem with truth is how do you convey the truth? Do you convey the truth that will leave in the end you to decide to pick up the truth or to reject it? Or do you have a program of truth that you want to beat into the people? A dogmatic program of truth, or a a program that is, then carried out by a state apparatus that tries to dogmatically enshrine the truth. I think that is a very, very different defining line. And in that sense, you could argue for the Polish dissidents and for the Czech dissidents and for any dissident in Eastern Germany, it was actually almost a kind of blessing not to be able to have recourse to means of violence. Because this is always a very, very strong temptation of anybody who wants to introduce a revolution. The key thing for thinkers like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Václav Havel, John Paul II, Lech Wałęsa, Adam Michnik, plenty of names here, was to basically convince people by their own lifestyle, by their own example, but trying to convince others to follow a truth that is enshrined in ideals that are not immediately executable, that you cannot go like power usually wants, my will is stronger than yours, I have the power behind, if I order you this, I command you this, you have to execute it. There was a lot of the conviction that was in something, in an end that you cannot immediately coerce. So the trouble with all that is there is no clear timeline. If you want to execute a policy, you have a timeline. We all work under time pressure. This has to be executed until the end of this month, or you have the next plan. I know Greece has still 4 months, for the next crisis to arrive, and to sort out that problem. But this is how politics works. Now, in the Eastern European case, the thing was that politics was, of course, no politics. In a communist system, there can be no politics. There is only, a parliament or a party is just a big, like an orchestra. And an orchestra that follows the command of its director. The only politics is those spaces and places in which there is opposition, resistance, if it is another opinion. So this so-called anti-politics of the search for truth was actually political, and this was why it was so dangerous. It was massively political because it undermined the dogmatic church, the dogmatic religion of the communist system. I don't know how much time I have. 5 minutes or 10 minutes? It's amazing. Well, thank you very much. I would like to. I have plenty of other examples here, but I will just go straight away into demonstrating perhaps 2 more things. One is what is a case for a spiritual approach, sort of like to speak a conscience approach in politics, and the other one is I would like to draw on John Paul II, who has quite a few quite deeply going and fundamental reflections on Europe, on dissidence, on self-defense, and on the role of good and on the fight between good and evil. And I'm by no means disinclined to answer later on any questions on Germany and on 1989 and the fall of the wall, because this is the subject, right? But I still would claim that what I'm talking about is actually absolutely core to that, because you need, in order to break down the wall, this is basically then an element of basically, just pushing the material structure. But what makes it push? What underlies this push? In order to get to that, you really need to study the history of communism and anti-communism and dissidence in Eastern Europe before that. This is not to say, again, that I would absolutely, downscale the importance of what happened in Eastern Germany, because I know that there was, especially in the second part of 1989, a lot of proper effort from inside. But we know also very well that the fact that there was so much pressure on the Eastern German regime from inside was mainly possible because civilizational prosperity, civilizational progress was more powerful in the West. But here comes the point. And John Paul II anchors that in the Cartesian revolution. René Descartes, who was, by the way, an absolute contemporary of Thomas Hobbes. And he said that the Cartesian revolution, cogito ergo sum, did subordinate the concern for esse, for being, to the concern for ens cogitans, for the thinking existence. So basically, what it was after Descartes, being, creation, or nature becomes the content or the function of your own human consciousness. So philosophy started to deal with human beings only to the extent as they were the content of human consciousness, rather than to the extent that they really exist outside human consciousness. Which means, I want to cut a long story short. Here I have to go very quickly, because it's not a philosophy seminar. I'm not a philosopher. But the point is that with all this civilizational progress with the West, of course, came the downsides. Came the Enlightenment project, came the fact that science and technology became so absolutely powerful. And as Eric Voegelin, a German political philosopher, Austrian political philosopher, once put it, the price of progress is the death of the spirit. The price of progress is the death of the spirit. So the key thing here is for John Paul II that a sort of backward country like Poland and other backward countries like in Eastern Europe had more resources to withstand that evil of communism, because communism was in a way an evil that was largely drawing on the negative aspects that came out of the Western European tradition. And I come back to what I said earlier about barbarian Russia. I think it's too easy to say Russia is so barbaric, because after all, Lenin and Trotsky and these guys, they took up Marxism. First of all, it was a Russian revolution, I don't doubt that at all. But Soviet communism was, ideologically speaking, a dogmatic enterprise that was largely based on a Western ideology coming from the center of the West, namely from Germany and England. So Marxism, with the form of Leninism that gives it the Russian touch, of course, which is very important, is not a barbaric ideology. It is a product of the Western Enlightenment. It is a product, it's an anti-product of capitalism, it's a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and so on and so forth. So I think this is something which I would like you to really reflect upon when we talk about the marginal parts of Europe, sort of the relatively less important, the ones that didn't produce the big wonders of architecture, religion, technology, science, capitalism, and so on and so forth. They were placed in a specific geographical space with specific resources, which they used in order to defend themselves. So John Paul II uses the term self-defense, samoobrona, which is the sort of like, well, now has been used for there has been a party in Poland which is called samoobrona, so you can, of course, use these terms in a different way now. But I think this is a key thought that links, I think, the politics of conscience to the question of the making of Europe in its own marginality. That we must not take everything that we get from the West and from the absolute dogmatic ideology that rules even today as the fundamental line to go down to. When you hear that we have to have austerity because we have to have budget discipline and we have to have economic growth, this in itself, and I'm very serious, are dogmatic beliefs. Now, I'm not saying that there are dogmatic beliefs of the same type as the red paradise of Trotsky or Stalin were. I'm not saying this because there is a much more discussion and consensus seeking that goes into that. But also here, we have to ask ourselves, and I'm coming really now to the end, because when we talk about making Europe from the margins, we are now in a situation in 2015 in we have new worlds in Europe. We have new different Europes. We have now the Southern and the Northern Europe. We didn't talk about that like 20 years ago. But now we have a sort of like a poorer Europe. And it's not only South and North, which is too easy to say, but let's look at that now. Let's look at Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, even France. They have more trouble with their budgets. They are more forced to comply with certain, obligations, and that's also important because, if you make debts, you have to pay them back. But I think this is something to think even today. It's not to say, okay, that was communism, that's gone, we overcome it, and now we just move on to business as usual. There is always the danger of succumbing to dogmatic, unreflected, fanatical ideas. And what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, I wouldn't say it's simply either just the bad guy, Mr. Putin. It's never as easy as that. There are also pressures from the other side who like to make us believe that we are in a new Cold War. And I think it's a very complex situation that we cannot address now, but I think one always has to be alert to the fact that what we take for granted is the truth, right? And the others are just basically, the things that we have to deal with, and we have to overcome them as quickly as possible. The key thing is the inner weight. What is the inner weight of your conviction? What is the inner weight of your conviction that you have to have austerity? What is the inner weight of your conviction that Ukraine has to become a NATO member? What is the inner weight of all your convictions? So in that sense, conscience is important because it is the part that will bring you, that underlies sort of like, when you go into a discussion, when you exchange opinions, when you make judgments, and even when you have to take decisions. So in a way, you have to be a little bit, as Pavel said, a little bit suspicious of yourself. We said that with regards to Václav Havel. So coming back, so if we look now, what are the fault lines now? Certainly one absolute amazing, important thing is what happens to the young generation? What happens to the young generations with that degree of unemployment in Spain and in Greece especially, in Portugal and in France and in Italy? So how do we transcend such fractures? So new generations have created now political forces, Syriza, Podemos in Spain. So these are young people, the leaders are under 40. They claim to break conventional logics of power. And if you look at Pablo Iglesias' blog, Pablo Iglesias is the leader of Podemos, he talks about civil disobedience. He takes up quite a few of these arguments. It's too early to judge now whether we can talk of attempts at spiritual renewal or electoral strategies to achieve power. But the case is that the power of conscience needs to be prepared in the hearts and in the commitments of individuals, and it needs to adapt to new challenges. The challenge now is not communism anymore. The challenge now is what is communist in the thought or in the policies of Western democracies. What is communist in the sense is what is unreflected, dogmatic, what is just fanatically pushed into the heads of people at the expense of people, of human dignity, of the new generations, and so on and so forth. So the challenge is always on. The challenge is not that, what Gandhi did against British Empire, what Martin Luther King did against, for civil rights of blacks, what the Eastern dissidents did, and what the East Germans did against, to break down the wall. That is always reenacted anew. We have to redefine it for ourselves. We have to look, we have to ask ourselves, wait to see what's the challenge, and get ready. But don't forget, chi va piano va sano e va lontano. Thank you very much. Thanks.